Thanks, Chair. And if you don't mind, if we do it back and forth, if that's okay with the 5 minutes, just because I have a couple of specific questions to ask. I suppose on that story about the large energy users being subsidised by domestic users and the practice, the rebalancing of tariffs that went on for 12 years. So I understand that the Minister contacted what would have been CEO at the time in 2009, asking that the rebalancing would be made permanent. And that while at the time the government memo conceded that this would be an unpopular measure, that domestic users could still shop around or reduce their energy use to bring down their costs. So I suppose the first question is really, what was the reaction of the CRU or CEO to this? Because you are an independent body, so did you carry out any analysis of what was going to be the impact for domestic users if we were going to rebalance the network tariffs in favour of the large energy users?
So I think maybe to put it in context at the time, it was not a single measure on its own. There were a package of measures, some of which did benefit domestic customers as well. We engaged with the department and the minister at the time. It was in a time of crisis, and we work within, well, we are independent in our decision making. We do work within an overarching policy framework, and much as we worked through the National Emergency Security Framework in this crisis, we worked with the department and the minister in that. I think there was some analysis done around just the impacts at the time, which were probably more based around looking at the international comparisons of energy costs for large users in Ireland versus in European countries, as well as the average cost.
Did you compare that, I suppose, at the time as well, that domestic users were also out of kilter with the rest of the EU, so we just have high energy costs in this country?
Oh, look, there was a package of measures, some of which benefited domestic users also, but yes, there was challenges in that period for all. So,
sorry, just to stop you, I don't mean to be rude, but the government memo at the time says that they were unwinding the measures for domestic users, and they wanted a permanent rebalancing in favour of large energy users that the domestic users would subsidise, so that the measures that had been put in place for domestic users were being taken away. And the memo clearly says that this would prove unpopular, but that domestic users can just shop around or reduce their energy use. And we now want to design a network tariff that favours large energy users at the cost of domestic users. So like the CRU's remit, your mission statement is, you know, to protect the public interest and to provide safe, secure, sustainable energy at a reasonable cost. So I suppose, how does that fit in with your mission statement that domestic users were now going to be penalised to pay for large energy users?
Yeah, I think you're referring to a government memo, so we can't comment on the specifics of the memo. But that was the government policy of the time. We work within a government policy framework. The challenge at the time, which we could all clearly see, was that large companies, large employers were leaving Ireland and leaving people jobless and unable to pay bills. Like that was part of the reality of the time. So that was the government policy, which the CRU engaged with the minister and the department on, and that was the decision that was taken at the time.
But
and there were other measures in place
push
to protect.
Back? Did it carry out any impact analysis of the? I mean, we know the financial crisis at the time. We know that we were losing jobs. We equally know that there were a lot of very hard-pressed families who are also in a financial crisis. So, yeah. I mean, did you push back, or did you do any analysis as to how fair this measure would be for domestic users?
I think the measure at the time came in at around the time when there was effective competition coming into the market at the same time. So we would have looked at the options for customers to shop around and effectively beat the impact of that measure by switching and getting savings from that. So it was, I suppose that was the level of engagement that we would have had.
Okay.
I don't know, Karen, would you like to come in on that?
Just in terms of the specific analysis that would have been done, I think further to the government decision being conveyed to us, we would have done analysis as it was implemented as part of the PUR3 framework. So it was the first year of the PUR3 framework. So in terms of the specific revenue analysis and tariff decision-making process for that 2010 for that particular year, there would have been an impact analysis for domestic customers to quantify what the incremental impact of that would have been for transmission and distribution tariffs. I suppose just to bear in mind, I suppose transmission network tariffs are a smaller component at that time of the order of sort of 25% of the overall customer's bill, and that would have been spread across all of the customers, the residential customers at the time. And as Aoife said, at that stage we were just, I think, in a newly deregulated market, and there was a really active competitive market in terms of supply offers that were available. So I suppose that would have been part of the analysis that would have fed into the decision at the time.
But the measure stayed in place for 12 years. So, I mean, was there regular engagement with ESB networks? Because the first thing is, the government's version of this was that it was going to be a €50 million per annum subvention or rebalancing towards local large energy users. What ESB networks seemed to have proposed was a percentage of the network charges was going to be skewed in favour of large energy users. So did they come forward with a submission to the CRU to say, this is how we propose to implement this government's decision? And did you engage with them on that? Because later on in the CRU letter of November, you admit that more than the €50 million per annum was more than likely to be paid. So one, I suppose, is who made the decision to not follow the €50 million but to go for a percentage model? And then secondly, was there regular engagement every year as to say whether or not this is justified to continue for 12 years after the financial crash, when we've got more large energy users coming into the market? Did you engage on a regular basis? And then the final thing is, do you have the total amount as to how much? Because we've heard figures of 600 million, other figures of 70 million per annum. So do we have a final figure as to exactly how much this has cost domestic users for the last 12 years?
Okay, there's a lot to that. So I think we, in each annual tariff decision, would have very clearly called out that the permanent measure, as it was at the time, was still in place, and we would have called out the €50 million was being rebalanced. So that was in every annual tariff decision from the date until more recently, when we decided to reverse it. We would have signalled, I think, over the last couple of years that we were looking at this, and I think then we initiated a major review of overall network charges in the context, not just of this measure, but more generally, how are we using networks in Ireland? What's the right basis for charging various types of customers for different uses, given the decarbonisation agenda and different ways the customers will be using energy and networks in Ireland. So we started that review. I think then what happened was, in the context of the more recent crisis and the work on the National Energy Security Framework series of actions, we realised we didn't have time to wait for the outcome of that review, and we wanted to bring forward the reversal of that measure. And Karen, would you like to come in on some of the other?
Yeah, so as Aoife said, I suppose that would have formed part of the annual revenue and tariff decision. We set a framework on a 5-year basis, and then annually we will look at what the specific revenue is for that given year, and there'll be...
Do you have the figures for each year?
They would have been published annually in each decision, but in terms of...
But you weren't able to give us an answer when the committee asked for the overall figure for the 12 years. We didn't. You said that it would be reconciled when the thing is unwound, when it's closed down, the final figure. So do you have it annually, or are you still calculating how much it was?
So the amount, that the decision that was set out by the Commission, I think there's references in that document to the documents going back at the time, which would have set out the implementation plan of the Commission for how this was intended to be done. It was 50 million was to be split between distribution and transmission revenue, between EirGrid and ESB networks. And as Aoife said, on foot of the commencement of our overall network tariff structure review, which was the planning for that started in 2020. I think in the revenue decisions of 20 and 21, we flagged that we would be looking at this and looking at reversing this decision. So earlier in March of last year, we engaged with ESB Networks and EirGrid to do some preliminary analysis around looking at the reversal of that measure. There was a decision of the Commission at that time to reverse that decision. In that process, ESB Networks identified to us that they had applied this measure as an annual percentage and not as a fixed amount.
Sorry, I know I'm going over to, but that's the key point, is that you're saying that ESB Networks flagged when you said you were going to unwind it, that it actually wasn't a 50 million, it was a percentage. But what due diligence had been carried out for the last 12 years that only came to the attention when it was being unwound?
So on an annual basis, when we review the allowed revenue, so we will set an overall framework which is profiled over 5 years, and then each year we will look at, there'll be swings and roundabouts in terms of inflation figures, energy forecasts, unaccounted for costs, and see we will scrutinise all of those costs on an annual basis to ensure that they're efficiently incurred. The inclusion of this money doesn't impact on that overall revenue, because it was about the total amount to be recovered. Where I suppose this was, the way in which it was implemented meant that more was recovered from one pot and less from another. So within that context, but the overall amount of the revenue that we would have set on an annual basis was adhered to. And so it wasn't until we looked to reverse it that ESB Networks identified this. And so I suppose the follow-on piece of work further to the Commission's decision in March, where we said we will reverse the rebalancing piece, and we will do a further piece of work to look in detail, to look at how it was applied and the individual costs, and that piece of reconciliation work will happen this year as part of our annual tariffing exercise.
Okay, I'll leave it at that. If you want to come back in the second round,